Welcome to DC Velocity's Thought Leader series. My name is Mark Solomon. I'm a senior editor at DC Velocity magazine. This series is being produced in conjunction with MHI. We are pleased to be joined today by Thomas W. Malone, who's the Patrick McGovern Professor of Management at the MIT Sloan School of Management. He's also the founding director of the MIT Center for Collective Intelligence. And he was also the founder and director of the MIT Center for Coordination Science and one of the two founding co-directors of the university's initiative on inventing the organizations of the 21st century. Professor Malone predicted back in an article in 1987 that many of the major developments that we take for granted right now in electronic business, including electronic buying and selling for many kinds of products, would actually develop over the next quarter century. And here we are. Professor Malone, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
When you were creating this article, what prompted you to think that we would move into an era of digital commerce that we see today? What signposts did you read back in the late 80s to give you that foresight?
Well, I think one thing that helped me think about things like that was having spent my first 3 years after graduate school working at Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, Xerox PARC, where I don't know if you know the history of Xerox PARC, but in those days they were decades, or at least a decade or so ahead of the rest of the world. Living in our daily lives when I was there in the late 70s and early 80s with things like word processors and laser printers and display-oriented graphics on screens and all kinds of things like that that we now all completely take for granted, but that no one else in the world had in those days. So I think that kind of helped shape my intuition for the kinds of things that were possible electronically. And I think it then became kind of obvious to me that if it was possible to communicate electronically between different companies, one of the big things we would use that for would be electronic buying and selling.
Could you have conceived back then what has evolved over the next close to 30 years?
Well, it's hard to remember exactly what I thought back in those days, but I do think that a lot of the things we thought about back in the 1980s and since are the kinds of things that have happened. So I don't think I've been hugely surprised by the broad trends. I do have to say that in the dot-com boom, I was surprised that things were happening so fast. I thought, yes, these are all the kinds of things I've been saying for years would happen, but I never thought they would happen so fast. In fact, they didn't actually happen so fast. A lot of them stopped for a while in the dot-com bust. And then now, years later, those things are actually happening. In a lot of ways, I think the ways I would have expected. Some things I think have been surprising to me too. I just heard Jimmy Wales talk today and talked about the early days of Wikipedia. I think I was surprised, as was he and nearly everyone else, at how Wikipedia worked in detail, the ability of so many people working so independently, or at least with so little centralized control, and the amazing good things that have come from that.
The organization of the 21st century, as you see it, is it a type of Wikipedia organization that you would foresee? More collaboration, more cooperation, a greater sense of community within the organization? Is that what you envision the organization of the 21st century to look like?
Well, I think there'll be lots of different kinds of organizations in the 21st century. But one of the things I think will be most important about many of them is that there'll be much more human freedom in business in the current century than there has been, or than there was in the last century. I think cheap communication technologies make it possible for lots more people to have a lot more information. That makes it possible for them to make more intelligent decisions for themselves instead of just waiting for orders from someone above them in a hierarchy who supposedly knows more than they do. And that means that more people can make their own decisions. And the benefit of having them do that is that we get both the benefits of economies of scale from large-scale coordination, but we also get the benefits of smallness, people being more highly motivated, more creative, and having more freedom.
What challenge does that pose for managers who have been trained in a more traditional approach that could be antithetical to what you just described?
I think that's a very important question. One of the slogans I use in the book is to say that we need to move from the traditional view of management as command and control to a more flexible view of management as coordinate and cultivate. So I think managers need to be open to helping coordinate the activities, whether they do that in a top-down way by giving orders, or in a more bottom-up way by facilitating the possibilities for what people can do and how they can work together. Similarly, cultivation, I think, means that sometimes you take drastic top-down actions, but sometimes you just encourage the tendencies that are already there and help them develop in the most fruitful ways.
Based on perhaps anecdotal evidence, are you seeing, in general, companies gaining traction in that thought process, or is it a challenge?
Well, I think some are, some aren't. I think that some of the most interesting examples of this new way of organizing actually come from relatively new companies, companies that grew up this way from the beginning. Google, for instance, is an example I use about a company that internally, in many ways, is still pretty decentralized. Lots of small project teams working together in very collaborative, decentralized ways. eBay is another example of an organization that's using this approach where, in this case, I don't just mean eBay the corporation, I mean eBay the community. The thousands and thousands of people who buy and sell things in the eBay community are, in some sense, at least the sellers, are part of a giant retailing organization for which eBay the corporation provides the infrastructure, but the independent sellers in this community do most of the core work of retailing.
If you were to glimpse at the future in 2039, putting technology aside if you can, what can you see developing? What do you see as a visionary idea that will become mainstream 2 decades from now?
Well, the thing that I find most helpful in thinking about that question now is the perspective of viewing things from the point of view of collective intelligence. In other words, we have in the past often thought of individual intelligence and individuals leading organizations, but we now have the possibilities for many more ways for people and computers to work together. In fact, we think that one of the key questions is how can people and computers be connected so that collectively they act more intelligently than any person, group, or computer has ever done before. So I think by 2039, we'll see some very new ways of that happening, much more crowd-based participation in things, many more symbiotic synergies between people and computers, each doing part of the thinking and part of the communicating, and lots of people and lots of computers doing things in ways that are far more flexible and far more intelligent than our traditional hierarchical corporations.
Last question. If you were, and I know you made a presentation earlier, sitting with a group of executives from this industry and giving them one message that they could apply to their business today, what would that be?
I think it would be this, along the lines of this theme of collective intelligence. It would be to say, let's think about how the different organizations in this industry can each themselves become more collectively intelligent, and perhaps even more importantly, how can the industry as a whole become more collectively intelligent?
Thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you.